Okay, this video is for preparation for your physics respiration test, which you should have been, again, reviewing for all these past 4 or 5 days. You've already had an opportunity to take this test, most of you. Those of you that haven't should have come and gotten a version of the exam to take home and go over. The test, a lot of people did poorly on, some people did very well on. Everyone will retake it and you'll get the best of the two scores. Now understand this material will be on your end of course exam and will probably be on your pro core exam that you're taking as soon as you get back on that Thursday. So make sure that you are prepared for this. And don't forget to do the ecology preparation as well. So in this review and your second in preparation for your second attempt at the photosynthesis respiration exam, let's go over the answers to the questions. The questions that you're going to receive on Monday are going to be very similar. The first question asks the pathway labeled figure A in figure A, that's this figure, right? In figure 9.1, labeled A in figure 9.1, is called glycolysis. Is that true or false? Well, let's take a look at figure A, pathway A. Pathway A sees, as you can see, you have glucose going to pyruvic acid. That is glycolysis. And in fact, glycolysis, you can see, is happening in all three of these. So in that sense, it is correct. However, the pathway is not complete there. The pathway continues through lactic acid, and you're producing 2-ATP. Lactic acid is produced in only one pathway that you've been taught, and that pathway is called, I hope you've said, fermentation. So the pathway here, if you wanted to say glycolysis, you could say glycolysis and fermentation would be the best answer to write in here as a final answer. It is false. It is not glycolysis, so that would be correct. This is someone's exam. That's why it's blacked out. You'll see here is which of the following is an autotroph. An autotroph, if you remember correctly, is an organism that produces its own food. So anything that eats something that someone else provided or eats another creature is not an autotroph. A leopard, as you know, is a hunter, and therefore an animal, any animal is, no animal is an autotroph. Only plants are autotrophs and some bacteria. So leopards are not autotrophs. Impalas, which are sort of like antelopes, are not autotrophs either. Mushrooms is an interesting one. Some people put mushrooms. As I graded them, I noticed some people put mushrooms. Mushrooms are fungi, and fungi they are decomposers, and as decomposers, they eat dead things, right? Dead or dying leaves, skin, whatever they find, they land on, their spores land on, they start to eat. And so whenever you see a mushroom, remember, they're decomposers. They're eating other things. They don't produce their own food. In fact, you should know this because all autotrophs need to be green because they're doing photosynthesis, right? There are some chemotrophs that are autotrophs, but for the most part, you're talking about photosynthesis. And therefore, you're looking for a plant or an algae or a photosynthesizing bacteria, something like that. And so in the case of these four answer choices, the answer would be a tree. The obvious answer is a tree. So I'm very disappointed that a lot of people did not choose that. You did not focus on the definition of autotroph versus heterotroph that was on the homework packet that was given to you 3 weeks ago and also discussed in class. So getting that one wrong was I wasn't too happy about that. So a student in collecting the gas given off by a plant in bright sunlight at a temperature 27 degrees Celsius, the gas being collected is probably oxygen. That is correct. Now, I want to remind you that plants take in as far as their net production and net absorption, they produce a net O2, but they do use they do produce CO2 as well, since they do respiration, but they use that CO2 in producing more sugars. So this particular question is asking a gas given off by the plant. Hopefully everyone would choose now oxygen given off by the plant. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people put carbon dioxide. That was a real big problem, and even in the short answers, people were putting carbon dioxide for some reason. You were confusing them. You need to correct that mistake for the test on Monday, and certainly for any test you take from now on. ATP is not a gas, and vaporized water. It is letting out water gas, but via transpiration. However, the gas is mostly oxygen that's being collected. Photosynthesis uses sunlight to convert water and carbon dioxide into, well, I don't need to see the other choices because I know it, and hopefully you by this point you should know it as well. If you're talking about photosynthesis, what are you doing? You're making sugar, right? C6H12O6. It's glucose. Now, as you know, if you've studied this in detail, if you paid attention in class, glucose is not the final product of the Calvin cycle. It's a 3-carbon sugar, but a couple of those 3-carbon sugars are connected to make this glucose molecule down the line. The final product of photosynthesis is sugar. It's going to be a sugar, and ultimately the concept is you have glucose. So you have sunlight, you're taking in water. Remember, the water is the first electron donor. It's broken up immediately into oxygen gas, which is why oxygen gas is released from photosynthesis. And it's taking in carbon dioxide. Where's that carbon dioxide going? That CO2 is going right, that carbon from CO2 is going right into the sugar in the Calvin cycle. Remember, and if you paid attention, you did your homework, which unfortunately a lot of you didn't. I hate to keep saying that, but it's important that you all understand that if you don't do the homework, you're not going to be able to understand and be able to answer questions like these. The Calvin cycle is the second half of the process, and that's where you capture the CO2 and make glucose. Let's take a look at the rest of the choices and see if we can get the right answer. It says high energy sugars, and it says oxygen and high energy sugars in ATP and oxygen. Well, what would be the ultimate goal of photosynthesis? It'd mean to make those high energy sugars, so you know that's going to be an answer. Your best answer is oxygen and high energy sugar. And why is that the best answer? It's the best answer because you do produce oxygen in photosynthesis and you are producing high energy sugars. So yes, high energy sugars would be an answer, it would be correct, but it's not the best answer. So the best answer is going to be oxygen and high energy sugars. Now again, do you produce ATP and oxygen? You sure do, but the ATP is used up in making the sugar because the end product is the sugar. Now let's go over that one more time, and I'll just kind of do it in a simplified way. Let's think about this. You're taking in sunlight. You're changing that sunlight. Let's just put it as a box. And in photosystem 2, you're capturing and breaking off water, right? Just again, very simple, simplistic view. You're taking water, H2O, and you're breaking up an oxygen gas, and that's being let off by the plant. That's gone. The hydrogen ions are going to be used in the electron transport chain in this process in between photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. We're going to produce a hydrogen ion concentration, and that hydrogen ion concentration is going to make us some ATP. Now ATP is just going to be chock full of energy, and so that's key. That ATP that's produced because of the hydrogen ion concentration is going to go off into the Calvin cycle. Now remember, the Calvin cycle is also known as the dark cycle. The only reason they used to call it the Calvin cycle, the dark cycle, is because it didn't require light. we also, another name for it, which is used in the test, is the light independent reactions, right? So independent meaning does not depend on light. These obviously, these reactions up here, in the first set of reactions, these reactions do depend on light. Hence their name, photosystems, photosystem. So the ATP from this process that we've discussed, of transferring electrons from one carrier to the other, creating a hydrogen ion concentration, then allowing those hydrogen ions to flow through and produce ATP, that chemiosmotic gradient producing ATP is sending all that ATP to the Calvin cycle. Then the final electron acceptor here is NADPH. Now there's an extra P in there, and it's slightly different from NADH. It functions the same way. It's going to take the electrons, in this case 2 electrons, from photosystem 2 into the Calvin cycle. And so what we get is a Calvin cycle is, and then NADP plus goes back, and so does ADP. All going back and in a giant cycle to replenish the supply of NADPH and ATP necessary to run the Calvin cycle. Now in the Calvin cycle, there's a lot of steps. We've discussed it. The ultimate idea, and the thing that you have to remember, is that the Calvin cycle has that Rubisco enzyme protein, and that Rubisco is taking in CO2, is capturing CO2, and out at the end of this whole process, the whole reason the whole kit and caboodle is happening is to get that high energy, let's just call it a high energy sugar. Ultimately it produces glucose, but high energy sugar. And so we have 2 things that are being produced and getting sent out of all this process. Everything else is being reused. You see the ATP is going to be used in the Calvin cycle here. ADP is going to come back. NADPH is going to be put into here. Water's used up, right? So what's being produced is oxygen gas that's leaving the system and high energy sugars. So those are 2 things that are being produced by photosynthesis. That's the nuts and bolts of it. The details we've gone over in class. You have all kinds of videos and reviews on it. You should go back and look at them because the details are important. However, we're just going to go ahead and focus on the answers to this test and see that we can reference that back again as we go through this. Which of the following are used in the overall reactions for photosynthesis? Used, and we just talked about it, so we know we're using carbon dioxide. Where do we use carbon dioxide? We're using it here, right? We're using carbon dioxide here in the Calvin cycle. Rubisco's taking it up. Where are we using water? We're using water right at the beginning at photosystem 2 to break up water, take out the hydrogen ions, and let the oxygen go. Actually, the oxygen could be used by the mitochondria in the plant, so remember that. But plants produce so much oxygen, a lot of it's released. So net, there's a release of oxygen, but they do use oxygen because they do respiration as well. Remember that. And light, of course. Photosynthesis uses 2 photons of light for every turn, right? So every time this comes around, you're going to have 1 photon, and then you're going to have another photon, and each time the electron's excited. And initially the electrons ripped off of water, right? So that's why the H pluses are positive. All right. So, and which of the following is used? All of them. So all of them is correct. This person's doing an okay job. A couple disappointing answers, but and D would be correct. All right. So the next question asks us the overall equation for photosynthesis and asks us how many molecules of each of these we're going to end up using. My suggestion is to go ahead and use the balanced equation for photosynthesis, and you can balance it yourself. However, let me just quickly write it out here. It's 6 CO2s plus 6 waters yields 1C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygen gases. Now, take a look at it and make sure that it's balanced. You have 6 and 2, that's 12, plus another 6, that's 18. 6 and 1 is 6, right? So 6 oxygens. And 6 and 2 is 12, so 6 and 12 is 18. So we have 18 oxygens on both sides. So hydrogens, 12. 6 and 2 is 12. We're good with that. 6 carbons, 6 carbons. So everything's balanced. And so for the question that is asked in question 6 is the overall equation for photosynthesis, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, there's a 6, result in 6 molecules of what? Well, it's only 1 molecule of glucose. There's 6 molecules of oxygen. And of course, you're using 6 molecules of water to get that. So that's what you're producing. So you're producing 6 molecules of oxygen. All right, so that would be the right answer there is C. So remembering that you have a full equation, the photosynthesis equation, this question was asking you to see if you understood that, and it's really an essential problem that you'll see asked over and over again. Do you understand that this CO2 goes directly into making a sugar? So if you're producing a sugar with 6 carbons, that those 6 carbons come from this carbon dioxide. You know, it's the same question that was asked in respiration. When we break this sugar up, remember, we break it up into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. Those 2 pyruvates go through the Kreb cycle and produce 6 CO2s. Well, that makes sense because the 6 carbons in this 1 carbon in each CO2 is coming from sugar. So this is an essential question that you're going to see asked over and over again in many different ways. So you need to start to learn and understand it, that the carbon that you find in sugar, that's in the chair, the pencil you're writing with, if you're writing with a wood pencil, in the chair that you're sitting on, in the food that you're eating, that sugar comes from the air, from CO2, the gas. So the answer here is oxygen, and it's letter C. Plants gather the sun's energy with light-absorbing molecules called, well, chloroplasts would be correct if they asked for the organelle. So that's fine. But they didn't ask for the organelle. They asked for the molecules, right? So you probably were looking at for the word chlorophyll. It might have accidentally put chloroplast, but that would be incorrect. So it's not C, because that's an organelle. The thylakoids are the part of the organelle. Remember, the membrane inside the chloroplast. So you have the chloroplast, and then you have those stacks, right, of the thylakoids that we call granum. All right, so the thylakoids would be the membrane. So again, they're not actually doing the absorbing either. Glucose is what's being produced. Chlorophyll is a pigment. And really, we went over it in class several times, and you really need to understand that, is this idea of chlorophyll being the pigment, right? It's a pigment that absorbs all light except for green. And we went over it in class. We looked at different people's different shirts and the different colors that we find. Those are all pigments that absorb everything but that color. Well, chlorophyll is a pigment that is found in chloroplasts, that is found in the thylakoid membrane, but it's a pigment that absorbs a specific frequency of light, everything but green. So the answer here is A, because it is a pigment. Most plants appear green because of, there's the word that you were confusing. This, I would hope that someone confused here. Know that one is a pigment, the other is the organelle. All right, so most plants appear green because of chlorophyll. Because chlorophyll does not absorb green light is correct. That is the correct answer. So the answer is A. It does the fact that it does not reflect violet light. It doesn't absorb green light. So those are wrong answers. And of course, none of the above is the wrong answer. So it does not absorb green light, and that's why you see green. And we went through that in class. Okay, well, where do the light-dependent reactions take place? Well, these light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid membranes. Remember, they have those membranes that have both photosystems as well as electron transport chains. So the answer is C. So, well done, whoever this was. This again, the stroma is a space, and outside the chloroplast would be absolutely incorrect. And only in chlorophyll molecules, that's not true. The chlorophyll molecules are used within the photosystems to capture the light. So the Calvin cycle is another name for light-independent reactions is correct. The light-dependent reactions are the photosystems. All right, and photosynthesis is the whole process, and all of the above would be wrong. So again, light-independent reactions. So the Calvin cycle takes place in the Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma. So remember, the stroma is this area here that's not in the membrane, right? So these are processes, a series of chemical reactions that are where you're going to finally capture CO2 and turn it into a sugar, high energy sugar. So it would not be in the thylakoid membrane, and they're not in the photosystems, and they're not in the chlorophyll molecules. All three of those have to do with the photosystem, the light dependent reaction. So Calvin cycles a light independent reaction, and it's happening in the stroma, and so that would be A. So this was actually one of those questions that was kind of nitpicky, but I think it's a fair question. I just think it was a tough one. So if you got that one wrong, I wouldn't be too devastated. What is the product of the Calvin cycle? It's a high energy sugar, and you should know that. That's what we talked about. I just went through it with you. So that's the high energy sugar. It's not ATP. ATP is actually used. Oxygen gas is produced in photosystem 2, and carbon dioxide gas is also used. So the only real answer there is C. And so again, good job, whoever this was. Which of the following is not a stage of cellular respiration? And cellular respiration is a series of processes, right? And so the only part here that's not part of cellular respiration, so glycolysis is part of that. It's the anaerobic part of cellular respiration, so that's a check. The Kreb cycle is part of that, so that's a check, and they're asking for not part of it, right? Electron transport is a check because that's part of it. So there's 3 steps to several steps. There's 4 really, but 3.5 steps to cellular respiration. But the one little caveat, the one little place that after glycolysis and you have a pyruvate, that if you don't have oxygen, you can take that pathway, and it's not cellular respiration because it's just trying to keep the cell going in times where there's no oxygen or not enough oxygen present. Is this concept, is this process, is this pathway called fermentation, right? And there's 2 kinds. There's alcohol, and then there's lactic acid fermentation, which is what the one we do. We do lactic acid. Yeast and bacteria will do alcohol fermentation. But in any case, fermentation is the answer because the word not was in the sentence. Of course, if you thought if the answer was which of these was a part of cellular respiration, you'd have to pick all 3. So hopefully that gave you a clue. This person obviously wasn't quite sure what was going on. Which of the following is released during cellular respiration? So here again, another question. We really don't need to see the answer choice to answer which of the following is a product of cellular respiration. You should know that there's 2 products of cellular respiration. CO2, which we breathe out. That's that sugar that was broken up and put out. There's going to be 6 of those, right? So if you want to look up here, I'll reference you up here to the photosynthesis equation. We're doing this backwards, right? So if photosynthesis we're producing sugar and oxygen, in respiration you're doing this backwards, and that's another question in the test, by the way. You know that you're going to produce this CO2, and then this water. So you're producing CO2 and water, right? And in fact, you should know 6 CO2 and 6 water. So that's something you should know from what we just discussed a moment ago. Let's go look at what the answer is, what the answer choices are, and choose the best answer. Well, oxygen is not being produced, and that's because that's being used. So that's not an answer. Air is not an answer. It's too general, if anything. Energy, is energy being produced? Sure, ATP is being produced. So, yeah, ATP is being produced. That's another one that we didn't put down. But so is oxygen, or CO2, and water. Right? So this is energy, and lactic acid is not being produced if you're doing cellular respiration. Remember, cellular respiration is not the lactic acid pathway, not fermentation, right? So there it is. That's the answer. The answer choice is C. Let me just go ahead and put that out there. C, all right? Cellular respiration uses one molecule of glucose to produce. Now, here's a question that's an interesting one. I happen not to like this question because these two choices, 36 and 38, are a little bit unfair to give you. The truth is that both are possible. You can get 36 or 38. It all depends on how efficient the particular run of respiration is, or the conditions under which respiration is occurring. So if everything's working perfectly and you're getting the max energy out of that sugar molecule, you're going to get 38. So the answer would be 38. However, often and sometimes you produce a total of 36. And that has to do with where the electrons come in the electron transport chain. So 36 and 38, if you put C or D in this particular answer choice, I will have given it to you. And this is one of the reasons I gave everyone 10% on the test, because I felt about 10% of the questions were just slightly unfair, and this would have been one of them. I feel that this is actually a bad question because of that possibility of producing either 36 or 38. Remember, where did we produce them? We produced 2 ATPs in the citric acid cycle or the Kreb cycle, however you want to call it. Remember, there's 3 names for that cycle. You produced 2 ATPs in glycolysis, net, right? 4 total, but 2 because you had to use 2. And then you produced either 32 or 34 in oxidative phosphorylation, or we call the electron transport chain, right? Also known as chemiosmosis. So every one of these has 3 different names. Each name kind of focuses on a different function or different aspect of the cycle or process. Okay, so 36 and 38, they're both correct. So if you put either one of them, I'm okay with it. And I've already given you credit for that with the 10% that I added to your grade. And again, it wasn't giving you anything. It was making the test fair because of the questions that I felt were slightly misleading. All right, so which of these is a product of cellular respiration? Product of cellular respiration, again, you should know, as I mentioned up here, ATP, CO2, water are all produced in cellular respiration, the opposite of photosynthesis, right? So which of these is a product of cellular respiration? Water. Yes, that's true. Glucose is not a product. It's being used, right? Oxygen is not a product. It's being used. All of the above is wrong. So the only possible answer is B, and that's a correct answer. Which of these processes take place in the cytoplasm of the cell? So the cytoplasm of the cell, glycolysis is the only one that happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. All the rest of everything else in cellular respiration happens in the mitochondria, but don't forget you have this little kind of side thing that a lot of people keep forgetting is fermentation also happens in the cytoplasm. There's a lot of stuff going on in the cytoplasm, but glycolysis and fermentation and energy processing in the cell is an important concept for you to get. All right, so glycolysis provides a cell with the net gain of not 4, but 2. And someone almost had it right. Remember, it produces 4. He or she was right. It does produce 4, but you had a net of 2. So very close. Good try. Lactic acid fermentation. I just want to say good try, because I'm so happy that no one put, or this person did not put 18 or 36. It lets me know that they studied enough to know it was either one of these two, and they just kind of got it a little confused. And again, considering she's going to have, or he or she's going to have a second chance, I think it's a great, a very close answer to pick. If someone chose 18 or 36, I'd ask, do you understand what glycolysis is, right? So lactic acid fermentation occurs in, well, it's happening in, first of all, it's in the cytoplasm. It's not in the mitochondria, so that can't be the answer, right? Any environment containing oxygen. Well, fermentation is when there is no oxygen, or little oxygen, right? Think of a runner running out of oxygen, a long distance runner running out of oxygen at mile 10 or 15, and they start to breathe heavier and heavier, and their muscles get weaker and weaker. So that's where fermentation comes in, because they can't get enough oxygen to those muscles to produce enough ATP to keep them going. Okay, so lactic acid fermentation occurs not in bread dough, because bread dough is being inflated by CO2 produced in alcohol fermentation, so by yeast. They don't produce, the alcohol is burned off, so you won't get drunk from eating bread. But in other forms of fermentation, you use the same yeast to ferment things to make beer or other kinds of drinking alcohol, or even the rubbing alcohol that you put on a cut or sterilize something. Any environment containing oxygen, obviously not, because oxygen is about, fermentation is about the lack of oxygen, no or little oxygen. So that's what fermentation's about. So remember that. And of course, the answer then is muscle cells. It is happening in muscle cells. Does happen when there's a lack of oxygen, right? You will produce lactic acid in those muscle cells. The two types of fermentation are called alcoholic and lactic acid. That is correct. So this person remembered the two types of fermentation. They just had some of the details. They're a little vague. So if you're this person as you're watching this video, please make sure you're taking a look at it and cleaning up the small mistakes that could really get you a much better grade when you redo it on Monday. In the presence of oxygen, let's go make sure we understand that alcohol anaerobic is wrong, right? Aerobic means oxygen's present. Fermentation means it's not present, so that doesn't make sense. Alcohol fermentation, remember, is happening. You have alcohol and you have lactic acid. And so here you're talking about mammals, or let's specifically say humans, animals in general, right? And in alcohol, we're talking about bacteria and yeast, right? And yeast is used to raise bread. So anaerobic and aerobic are opposites, so that would not be working very well. And lactic acid and anaerobic, they're not the two types. So the answer is lactic acid and alcohol fermentation. In the presence of oxygen, glycolysis is followed by, so when there's oxygen present, where's that pyruvate going to go? If it wasn't present, if oxygen wasn't present, it would go to fermentation. But because it is present, it would go to the next step in cellular respiration. So it would not go to lactic acid fermentation, because it says in the presence of oxygen, right? So when oxygen is present. And so again, this was a very tricky question, I guess, but it really is a great question, because it really tests your understanding of fermentation versus respiration, cellular respiration. So it's not alcohol fermentation either. It's not photosynthesis. So really, it was a really fair question. It was very fair if you understood this really basic concept. When you have oxygen, it continues on through cellular respiration. When you don't have oxygen, it goes over to fermentation. So the next step in cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle right after glycolysis. So D is the answer to that. The starting molecule for the Krebs cycle, very thing that comes in as you start the Krebs cycle itself. Um, you know, this is another tricky question. It's not coenzyme A. That's added to pyruvic acid after pyruvic acid's lost its carbon, right? Coenzyme A, it helps the process go. Um, so it can't be that. And unfortunately, some people did choose coenzyme A, and I'd say that was a pretty good answer. NADH does enter the process, but it's not the starting molecule. Glucose was the starting molecule for glycolysis. It's actually pyruvic acid in a sense. You know, it's one of those things where it depends on where you draw the line. The Krebs cycle, right before you start get into the Krebs cycle, you've already gotten rid of pyruvic acid. You have two carbon molecule that you attach coenzyme A to. So this is another one of those questions I feel very they're kind of misleading, and again one of those that 10% that was very tough. But pyruvic acid is the best answer. Some people, I suppose, would say coenzyme A is the best answer, but again, that's why I don't like the question. All right, in eukaryotes, and you might ask, why do I just choose these questions offline then, and not just use the ones I make up? And the issue is, I want you to get a feel of all the possible questions that could come at you on a state exam or an ACT test. It's important that you get other people's questions and that you be able to analyze them and see where other people have gone wrong and question the question and be able to answer the right answer. All right, so in eukaryotes, electron transport occurs in the mitochondria, is correct. And we're talking about electron transport. Also occurs in the chloroplast, and this is another one of those questions. This is another one. So it does happen in mitochondria. It does happen in chloroplast. It does not happen in cell membranes. And it doesn't happen in the cytoplasm. So if you chose A or B here, you're good. You understand the concept. But understand electron transport happens in both mitochondria and chloroplasts. All right, moving on. Oh, why did I choose? Over here I put a check instead of putting A. Okay, well, there you go. All right, let's move on then. All right, so the next question is the energy of electrons passed along the electron transport chain is used to make, well, directly, and this is something I keep trying to push, and I hope you're getting it, is it directly, if this is the membrane and you have these proteins in here, and you have these little ones that are transporting these proteins from one carrier to one place to the next, and then you have this machine that's using... it's producing ATPs here. Your electrons that are being passed from one carrier to the next directly is being used to create a hydrogen ion concentration, a high and a low. And remember, high to low does not require energy to have these ions move. So over here you have a low hydrogen ion concentration. Over here you have a high hydrogen ion concentration. But that in itself, that energy, that material, those hydrogen ions are going to move quickly through the ATP synthase, and then what that's going to do is it's going to take ADP and inorganic phosphate, and it's going to make ATP, right? And that's the whole goal, right? Is to make ATP of the electron transport chain, and it happens in both photosynthesis, ETC, electron transport chain, and in respiration. And in respiration happens in the mitochondria, and in photosynthesis it happens in the chloroplasts. But in either case, the point is you're making ATP, and that's the goal. So now let's go ahead and take a look at those answers again. The energy of electrons passing along the electron transport chain is used to make not lactic acid, not citric acid. Citric acid would be the Krebs cycle, right? And you're getting the electrons out of that. And lactic acid is where, I hope you say, fermentation, right? So the electron transport chain is neither one of those. And of course, alcohol is, again, what? fermentation. So there's two processes: use alcohol or lactic acid. So your answer is D, ATP. So this person was correct and it was D. Good answer. Now, how are cellular respiration and photosynthesis almost opposite? And we've talked about that. I just a few minutes ago, probably 10, 20 minutes ago, I said that photosynthesis is the process going in one direction. In other words, you're taking CO2 and water and you're making C6H12O6 sugar and oxygen, right? And in the opposite is cellular respiration, where you're taking oxygen and sugar and you're making CO2 and water. And so what you have is the products of one are the reactants of the other. So let's take a look at what the answers here say. Photosynthesis releases energy and cellular respiration stores energy. Well, the opposite's true, first of all, and that doesn't make this process. This statement does not make them opposite one another, almost opposite one another, right? Because photosynthesis is not the release of energy. Cellular respiration is not the storing of energy. In fact, the opposite would be true, if anything. So this is incorrect. So photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and cellular respiration puts it back. Well, that's true. So let's just put a little asterisk by that, make sure to see if that's the answer. C, photosynthesis removes oxygen from the atmosphere and cellular respiration puts it back. We know that that's false. And if you don't know that, and I have to say some people don't, because based on the short answer responses, some people really don't. And of course, D is wrong. So the answer is B. It is the correct answer. So one is taking carbon dioxide out while the other one's putting it back into the air. Which of the following types of organisms does aerobic cellular respiration? Aerobic cellular respiration. So we're talking about cellular respiration. So we're not going to talk about photosynthesis. But remember, both autotrophs and heterotrophs do cellular respiration, and aerobic cellular respiration specifically. Heterotrophs, sure, they do it. Autotrophs do it too, though. So heterotrophs, so they say does, right? So both autotrophs and heterotrophs both do it. So guess what? The answer's C. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs do cellular respiration. This is an important idea, and I keep emphasizing over and over again. The test emphasizes it. I emphasize it. You got to know that both plants and animals, plants do both photosynthesis and respiration. Animals only do respiration. So whether they're heterotrophs, if the fungus or an animal or a prokaryote that's not doing photosynthesis, if you're an organism that doesn't do photosynthesis, you're doing cellular respiration. That's all you do. If you're an organism that is doing photosynthesis, you're also doing cellular respiration. You're doing both. So the answer here is C. C is the answer. The products of photosynthesis are the reactants of cellular respiration. So the products of photosynthesis, which would be what? Sugar and oxygen, are the reactants in cellular respiration. So B is the answer there. They're not the products of cellular respiration. They're not the products of glycolysis, and they're not the reactants of fermentation. So it's not A. The answer is B. All right. So again, I think you'll see that this is the same concept repeatedly asked in different ways to you. And there was a time crunch as well, which is, again, another reason why I felt that adding 10% to your grade was fair. Organisms that cannot make their own food and must obtain energy from the foods that they eat are called heterotrophs. So this is correct. Thylakoids, as you know now, are the membranes in the chloroplasts. Plants are autotrophs, and autotrophs make their own food. So B is the answer. And I should change this color to green, I think. Which of the following is false? A chloroplast contains stroma. That's true. This part is true, so it's not false, right? So you want to know what's false. That's not the answer because it's true. It is true. I'm going to put true here so nobody thinks that I'm putting a red line because it's not true. Stroma contains a thylakoid. The granum contains several thylakoids. A thylakoid contains chlorophyll. Now, which of these would not be true? Now, again, here's another question that I really don't like. Let's take a look at a thylakoid contains chlorophyll. That's true. And a granum contains several thylakoids. That's also true, right? So it all depends on how you look at it, but I'll go ahead and say that. And stroma contains thylakoid. I'm honestly going to say that that's true as well, but in the worst case scenario, it might not be considered containing it. The lumen is the space that surrounds the thylakoid. So it all depends on what you mean by the word contain. It's the best answer. B is the best answer, but I'm going to go ahead and say that I don't like this answer. And so I'll choose it because it's the best answer. I just don't like it. And maybe there's something I don't understand about it, but it seems to me that, again, an unfair and incorrect question, set of answers for this question. So I'll go ahead and choose B because it's the best answer, but I don't understand what their point is with that. What are the products of the light-dependent reactions, right? So light-dependent reactions, what would be the products of that? It's not going to be glucose, right? Because that's the products of the Calvin cycle. So obviously we know that photosystem 2 makes oxygen gas right away. So we know that that's definitely one. NADPH is definitely one. And ATP is one. Now, of course, the light-dependent reactions, part of that is the electron transport chain because that's involved in the transporting of electrons and creating the hydrogen ion concentration. So all three are the answer. The answer is D, and it is all three. So good job, this person. Which of the following is not a step in the light-dependent reactions, right? So what's not a step in the light-dependent reactions? Light-dependent reactions. So let's go ahead and figure this out. This person went back and forth trying to figure this out. ATP and NADPH are used to produce high-energy sugars. Well, that's the Calvin cycle. So this person is correct in choosing D because of this word not. It really caused a lot of issues for them. So high-energy electrons move through the electron transport chain. That does happen in the in the light-dependent reactions. In fact, we just answered the question above. Pigments in photosystem 2 absorb light. Well, we know that that's true, right? The chlorophyll absorbing light is part of the photosystem. ATP synthase allows hydrogen ions to pass through the thylakoid membrane, producing ATP. And we know again that that's part of the light reactions as well. Because without the other parts of photosystem 2 and 1, there would be no hydrogen ions for the membrane to move. And of course, the high energy electron moving from one carrier to the next is what moves the hydrogen ions to the high end of the concentration gradient. All right, so in any case, the answer is D, and it's the best answer. And it's a good question. So which pathway represents the flow of electrons during photosynthesis? So here again, photosynthesis, we're talking about the electrons moving from water to NADPH to the Calvin cycle. That's correct. Now, here, photosystem 1 to the Calvin cycle and NADPH. Remember, NADPH is the carrier, is a final electron acceptor of the light-dependent reactions that take the electron to the Calvin cycle. So it can't come after the Calvin cycle. That doesn't make sense. Oxygen to ADP, the Calvin cycle, that again doesn't make sense either, since again oxygen is being released as a byproduct. It's not a photosynthesis. It's not something that's used in photosynthesis. Water, photosystem 1, photosystem 2, that would be true, but it says during photosynthesis the best answer. Oh, by the way, this would not be true. My bad. Remember, photosystem 2 is first. Not. The numbers confuse people, but photosystem 2 is first, and photosystem 1. So that's not an answer. So the only reasonable answer, then again, is D. This person's on a roll. So if carbon dioxide is removed from a plant, from a plant's environment, what would you expect to happen to the plant's production of high energy sugars? Fewer sugars would be produced, right? So if you have less carbon dioxide, you're going to produce less sugar because that's where you're getting this. You see how this question is asked over and over again in so many different ways? So if you're producing more, you need CO2 to produce the sugars because that's where you're getting your carbon. So more sugars would be produced would be a bad answer, and same number of sugars would be produced without carbon dioxide. That's a bad answer. Carbon dioxide does not affect the production. Is a bad answer. So the right answer is B, and it's a really good question and fair. So a lot of good fair questions and a few just not about 10% just not good and confusing. Which of the following is the correct sequence of events in cellular respiration? And now that just asked about photosynthesis. Now let's look at cellular respiration, which happens in plants as well. So this happens in plants as well. This is, again, me trying to remind you of this. But let's go ahead and take a look at what are the possible answers. Now, you should know right now, after all these questions, that what the correct sequence of events in cellular respiration are going to be sugar gets turned into pyruvic acid or pyruvate. You get 2 ATPs net made. If there's no, in cellular respiration means that there's oxygen present, so that after glycolysis, you're going to go to the mitochondria, where the very first step before you get to the Krebs cycle, you take off a carbon, make a carbon dioxide, and you attach it CoA, goes into the Krebs cycle. You produce a lot of you produce some NADH and some FADH2s. Those are the electrons that are going off into the electron transport chain. The last 2 carbons of pyruvate are released as carbon dioxide, and then the electron transport chain, the electrons are transferred from NADH and FADH2 down the electron transport chain, producing a high to low hydrogen ion concentration, which is used to produce ATP. And there's the process. Now let's take a look at some answers. Glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. That's the correct answer. So when we look at glycolysis, fermentation, Krebs cycle, that's not right because fermentation is not part of the cellular respiration. Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, glycolysis. Glycolysis is in the front, not the end. Krebs cycle, glycolysis, electron transport. Again, glycolysis comes before the Krebs cycle, so this is the correct answer, C. What is the correct equation for cellular respiration? Well, it's going to be oxygen, sugar, CO2, water, and energy. And so the answer is A. O2, the rest is incorrect. So again, oxygen, sugar, CO2, water, and energy, right? That's the process. So what's the problem with this one here? That you need to add energy to it. Well, it's kind of true. You need to add a little bit of energy, but you get more back out. So that's the problem, is that you see energy here. So that's why that answer's wrong. It should be energy coming out. The net energy is what you're looking at in this equation. And so CO2 coming in for cellular respiration, you should know by now that you're breathing in oxygen, not carbon dioxide. You're breathing out carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide should be on the product side. So that's incorrect. And CO2, again, is on the reactant side. That's what makes that wrong as well. So A is the best answer. It's the only real answer. So that's a really good question. What are the reactants in the equation for cellular respiration? Cellular respiration, you're going to have glucose and oxygen. That's it. Those are your reactants. You're asking for reactants, glucose and oxygen. You're going to produce water and carbon dioxide. So that's where they're getting this carbon dioxide and water. They're trying to see if you understand reactants versus products. Oxygen and lactic acid. They're looking to see if you understand the difference between fermentation, right, and photosynthesis. That's what's happening there. And water and glucose. Water is produced, but not the glucose. Glucose is used, right? But they're asking for reactants, so glucose is a reactant, but water is produced, not a reactant. It's a reactant in photosynthesis. So that's it. C's the answer there. Good job, this person. And the starting molecule for glycolysis is glucose. That's absolutely correct. Good job. Pyruvic acid is the starting molecule for the Krebs cycle, if you like. I have kind of an issue with that, but that's fine. ADP is the starting molecule for any kind of ATP synthesis. It's used in various places in the cell. citric acid is one of the molecules that start off the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, right? So, so this is Krebs, and this is Krebs, and this is numerous places. And glucose is obviously glycolysis, glycolysis, the breaking up of glycogen. So you need glucose. The breaking up of glucose. So you need glucose. Which of the following is not the product of glycolysis? So what's at the end of glycolysis? We make ATP. That's true. We make NADH. That's true. And we make pyruvic acid. Remember, that was all in the homework, right? That was all like you counting up how many parts are made. This test was simply from your right out of your homework problems. So if you did your homework problems, these should be pretty easy. So what is not the product of glycolysis? It's glucose, because the whole point of glycolysis, again, to break up glycolysis. All three of these are a product of glucose. So the key is not, the word not. Which of the following acts as an electron carrier in cellular respiration? Well, NAD plus acts as an electron carrier is absolutely correct. NAD plus, FADH2. They could have put NADH, NADPH for photosynthesis. So any one of those are electron carriers. So pyruvic acid is moving, it goes on to the Krebs cycle. This, as we just said a moment ago, ADP turns into ATP, and ATP, these are the currency of the cell, the pre and post version of the currency in the cell. So one cause of muscle soreness is lactic acid fermentation, right? So we talked about that lactic acid buildup can cause some muscle soreness. Alcohol fermentation does not occur in the muscles, so that's not right. Glycolysis is the product of that is pyruvic acid or pyruvate, and was not involved in any kind of muscle soreness. And the Krebs cycle produces CO2 and electron carriers of NADH and FADH2, so again, not producing lactic acid. So fermentation is left to C, and that is correct. The conversion of pyruvic acid to lactic acid requires which of these? And NADH is the answer, if you remember from... It's interesting that this person got the pyruvic acid questions correct, but missed out on some understanding of of fermentation. So I'm not sure what's going on with this test. I don't know how you can get this question right and confuse some of the more basic questions on lactic acid fermentation. But in any case, this is fermentation. NADH is required. ATP, the ATP is made in glycolysis. The only reason you need fermentation to occur is to keep glycolysis going. So ATP is not something that lactic acid, turning pyruvic acid into lactic acid is required for. ATP is not required for that. You don't need oxygen. In fact, this happens only when there is no oxygen involved, available. And alcohol is not involved in making in the lactic acid production. In fact, it's the product instead of lactic acid in bacteria and yeast. All right, Krebs cycle starts with pyruvic acid yields carbon dioxide. This is the answer that's true, the most true. Glucose and yields 32. This is not true. All right. So in fact, there is nothing that starts with glucose and yields 32 ATP, right? Unless you're talking about the whole process of cellular respiration. But none of the individual steps starts with glucose and ends with 32 ATPs. 32 ATPs or 34 ATPs are produced in the electron transport chain. And that is the difference between, the efficiency of which is the difference between the 38 or the 36 in the previous question. So lactic acid that yields carbon dioxide, lactic acid that yields carbon dioxide, it doesn't start with lactic acid. And remember, lactic acid is fermentation. All right, pyruvic acid yields lactic acid or alcohol. That's fermentation, not Krebs cycle. So again, the Krebs cycle is correct, and this person got it right. Good job, this person. All right, the electron transport chain can be found in prokaryotes, in animals, in plants, in all the above. So that's right, all the above. Good job, this person. The electron transport chain is something that's very conserved. It's one of the basic, fundamental parts to all living things. It's like looking at different vehicles, cars, airplanes, motorcycles, bicycles, skateboards, roller skates, electric cars, gas cars. They all have wheels. They all have things that turn, that are round, right? And so that's a simple part of a more complicated machine. An electron transport chain, it's something that's very conserved, very essential to life, just like the wheel is essential to the machines that we make. So consider that these things, in fact, this is very conserved in evolution. So you'll see that this is found everywhere because it's very important to the processes of life. Let's take a look at this. So this was a tough one for some people. Though a lot of people did well on the extended response. In fact, people did better on the extended response than they did with the multiple choice. That might have had to do with how much time they spent on it, or there might have been to do with them underestimating the multiple choice questions, especially how much thinking might be involved in choosing a right answer with the multiple choice questions. But let's take a look at this essay. I think they're fairly simple. Again, all these questions came from various standardized exams and online sources, so this should be fairly easy to get. And I've seen something like this on some practice exams. A student prepared 2 beakers, identical sprigs of a water plant as shown below. So there's a water plant, there's a funnel, you can see there's a test tube, there's air bubbles coming up. They really shouldn't call them air bubbles. I didn't like that. They're not, it's not air coming up. They're not going to be air bubbles. They're gas bubbles for sure. So that was kind of a problem I saw right away. But again, what are we going to say? They put air bubbles. That's a standardized exam, but I don't like that they put air bubbles because it's not air. So identical sprigs of water plant as shown below. She placed one beaker in the shade and the other beaker in a fluorescent lamp. Now this is actually an answer to one of the questions, so it's kind of an interesting concept that I'm kind of disappointed people got wrong, because it seemed like you really shouldn't have gotten this too wrong if you were paying attention and you understand the concepts, and the concepts are pretty straightforward, right? So you got this beaker, one beaker's here, and let me go ahead and I'm sketching this quickly, so forgive me for not being neat, and I often tell you to go ahead and sketch it out, and it doesn't matter. And they sketch it out already for you, so life is good for you since it's already sketched out here. But one's in the light, and the other one's in the shade. Now, considering that this test is all about photosynthesis and respiration, I was very disappointed that people didn't understand, or that people didn't get it. And so this again is, in my opinion, a very easy, kind of fundamental setup. So here you have a setup that this one's in the shade, right? And this one's in the light. And so you have one in the light and one's in the shade. Well, what's going to happen in the light that's not going to happen in the shade? Well, I hope you're answering photosynthesis. After all this, I hope you're answering photosynthesis. So the thing is, if you're doing photosynthesis, when is the oxygen? Remember, what's really being produced here? What are we producing? What gas is being produced? Oxygen, right? That was one of the questions in the multiple choice. So again, I don't like this air bubble thing. I don't like that word, but it really is going to be oxygen. There's going to be some CO2 in there possibly, but it's not going to be air, right? So oxygen is being produced, and the plant is producing it, and it's releasing it as it does photosynthesis. So why did we put this plant in the shade if we know it's not going to do photosynthesis and it's not going to be minimal air bubbles? It says shade, so there might be some light over here. Didn't say complete blackness, but when we say it's in the shade, why would we put one in the shade when we know there's not going to be a lot of gas produced in the shade because there's not going to be a lot of photosynthesis? Well, that's going to be our control, right? And that's the whole point of a control, is what you compare something to. So if I'm moving this, I'm taking this experimental vessel, I'm moving it closer, further away from the light, and it changes how many gas bubbles are produced, how much gas is produced. How do I know that the gas bubbles are being produced because of the light and not because they are produced naturally on their own? How do I know that plants aren't doing cellular respiration without the need to produce, without the need to do photosynthesis? Maybe these are some kind of plant-looking animals or something. Well, I know that because I have an example, the exact same setup in the shade, and there's little or no bubbles being produced. So that means that light is necessary to produce the bubbles. So that's what this control is all about. So which of the beakers the students control? The students control beaker is the beaker in the dark, in the shade, is the answer. So any other answer here would have been wrong. So if the student later tested the air bubbles and collected the tube, and I think they're using the word air to get the idea for you to get the idea that this is a gas, but you should know it's gas, it's not air. Collected bubbles in a test tube. What would she find they were made of? And you should be able to say oxygen, and you should be able to say that it's oxygen because that's a plant doing photosynthesis, producing oxygen. So you should know that. So that's what I would expect you to be able to put. So I know that from these answers, who really understood kind of the basic concepts of photosynthesis and respiration, where the multiple choice got to you in the nitty gritty of it. All right, so using the tables and graphs, look at graph 8-4, and this is 8-4. The distance from the light, the greatest number of bubbles produced. Different people said different things, but I think the distance from the light that produced the greatest amount of bubbles was 5 centimeters, right? There it is. Anything around 5 I think would be fine, but I think 5 you can see is the max on the data that we have. All right, so we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 data points, right? Everything in between is being estimated. It's being regressed, linear regressed, predicted. All right, so look at the graph A4. What does the student data show? I hope you said, and a lot of people did say this. The further away you move the setup, the less bubbles you make, the less bubbles per minute that you make. Well, okay, that's fair. That's the answer. It's a basic answer to that question. If the lamp were placed closer to 5 centimeters from the water plant, would the plant give off many more bubbles? Why or why not? Well, you might say, well, at this point, it wouldn't give up. And this is kind of here, I think I would accept a lot of different answers. You might say, no, not many more, because what is many, right? You might say, well, if I increase the light, it could give up as many as another 5 bubbles per minute more, and to some people that could be many more. So as long as you went in detail, said yes or no, but some people might say no because to them that's not a lot, but say it would increase no matter what. It would definitely go up, but it's not going to be a great increase. I can certainly go with any answer there that is anything like that. Now, the next question has this paragraph for you, and it's the rest of the questions on the next page. That's why I drew this for you on the board and tried to make sure you understood that phenolphthalein is an acid-base indicator. It's a liquid that goes pink to clear in the presence of an acid, or in this case, a CO2, because CO2 in water, it makes carbonic acid. That's one of the reasons that our reefs are dying, because the oceans are becoming more acidic as we produce more CO2, and this CO2 gets absorbed by the oceans. So let's take a look at this setup and think about it for a second. Now we're not talking about a plant. The previous question was about a plant. This is an animal. It's a mouse. In the liquid vessels, they have phenolphthalein and water. You're pumping the air, which has some carbon dioxide and oxygen and nitrogen and all kinds of other components, and it's going into the liquid and it's bubbling out and going into the next tube and going into the liquid and then bubbling out, and it goes into this tube where there's no liquid, but there's a mouse. What's the mouse doing? If it's alive, what's it doing? Well, there's no food, so I hope you're not saying it's eating, but it's breathing, right? It's certainly breathing if it's alive, and let's assume it is alive. The mouse is breathing, so that means it's taking in oxygen and producing what? Hopefully you said CO2, because by now you should know that. So the mouse is producing CO2. So any air leaving this vessel, right, not coming in, because this air is coming in here and then moving out. Any air leaving this vessel is going to have higher levels of CO2, right? Because this thing's producing CO2, and as it breathes, and just in its process of life, it's breathing and it's producing CO2, and that gas gets put into this liquid. Now this liquid has more CO2 in it, so it's more acidic, so it's going to turn from pink to clear faster, from dark pink to light pink. It's going to change color. Versus these two, because these two have the standard amount of CO2 you would find in the air that we breathe in, where this vessel is going to contain much more CO2 because they have a mouse and they're breathing out CO2. So that's the idea. That's what you should be thinking of. You should be thinking of the idea that animals breathe out CO2, breathe in oxygen. Plants do cellular respiration as well, but they produce more oxygen and take in CO2. All right, so what will the mouse require to carry out cellular respiration? Oxygen. Yes, they'll need some sugar, but they'll have that in their liver. You can put a cracker or food if you like, but for sure, cellular respiration is going to require oxygen. Look at the flask 99212 A, B, C, D, right? Describe the flow of materials from the flask. Will the mouse receive fresh air so that it can survive? Yes, it will, because the oxygen is going to go flowing through here, and I explained that to you in the beginning of the test. Interpreting graphics, figure 9.2. How will the scientist be able to detect whether the mouse is carrying out cellular respiration? Well, I just described it. CO2 is going to turn. This is going to turn from pink to clear in the increased CO2, and that's going to happen because the mouse is breathing out CO2. Assume a scientist has an identical respiration chamber, same situation, except that this setup is placed by a cricket instead of a mouse. Now, what's the difference between a cricket and a mouse? Well, a cricket's an animal too, so it's breathing out CO2 as well, but it's much, much smaller. So it's going to produce, I hope you said, a lot less CO2. So in the end of an hour, she measured the CO2 given off by the cricket and the mouse, a small amount of CO2 that had been given off by the mouse, but little to no CO2 given off by the cricket. Was the cricket undergoing cellular respiration? Explain these results. Yes, it was. If it's alive, it's doing cellular respiration. It's an animal. So for sure it's doing cellular respiration. Why is this system not picking it up? Because the system is not sensitive enough. So how would you correct that? How could you correct if you had a cricket in here instead of a mouse? How could you make the system more calibrated towards a smaller creature? Well, one thing is you could add more creatures, more crickets in here. Add the same number of, add enough crickets that the mass of the mouse and the mass of the crickets is the same. So if this mouse is, 10 ounces and you had 10 ounces worth of crickets that are alive and crawling all over each other, breathing, that would probably correct the problem. The other thing you might do is reduce the liquid here, right? So that the gas is going to be more sensitive. It takes less CO2 to be absorbed by the liquid to change the phenolphthalein color. So those are two options you can do to fix the problem. So that's the issue. That's what's going on. Is the size of the bigger you are, the more CO2 you're producing. The more active you are, the more CO2 you're producing, right? So a mouse running around like crazy is going to produce, that they're breathing faster. If they're breathing faster, they're producing more because that's what they're breathing out, right? So you need to think that way. You need to think about the concept that as animals move faster, they're using up more glucose, they're breathing harder. You know that you guys play sports. You've seen people play sports. Their chests are moving up and down quickly because they're breathing those gases in and out. Assume the scientist set up identical chamber, but except that in this step she placed a mouse that had been exercising the hamster wheel. There we go. And then the scientists measured the amount of CO2 given off by both mouse. After 15 minutes, predict which setup would produce the most CO2, and hopefully you say the one that was exercising. And why? Because it was doing more cellular respiration. The exercise required more ATP, which required more sugar, which required more electrons to be transferred, which required more ATP to be produced. And so it moved everything quicker through the system. And so that's why you're producing more CO2 when you're exercising. That's why the cricket would produce less CO2. Expect a question very much like this. Obviously, a slightly different setup on your Monday exam. Please be prepared. I've gone over every question. Please go over it, even if you've done well, and be ready for Monday's exam. And just hit it out of the ballpark. Hit a home run on Monday, huh? All right, guys. Have a good day.